Final early vote of the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination fight happens in South Carolina this weekend. The campaign then goes way national for Super Tuesday. Joining me now live to discuss is Professor Joe Siracusa from RMIT. Professor, good afternoon. Thanks for joining me.
Good afternoon, Danica.
Firstly, let's look at the candidates. If Joe Biden doesn't win and win big in South Carolina, is it all over for him?
Yeah, Biden has, he's gambled here that he could beat everybody with double digits. Now, he might be whistling in the wind for all I know, because I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if he has the people in the background. But he's got the traditional African-American voters who see him as a friend and a close associate of Barack Obama. Bernie Sanders has very little cachet with these people. The other Democratic candidates probably even have less cachet. But let's say, Vice President Biden is going to have to deliver on this one. If not, he's going to be sitting out the rest of the election, wondering for the rest of his life what he did wrong. And then we go into Super Tuesday, where I think about 1/3 of the delegates are up. You need 1,991 to get across the line. You can't get all that on Tuesday, but you can get pretty close in the right direction. Bernie Sanders has got everybody, the establishment in the Democratic Party, frightened because they reckon he's just too far left wing. He's promising everybody everything: free child care, free health services, remission of debts for college debts, free public education at college level. I mean, you know, it's all about meat and potatoes, and he's got a huge following. It's just that he hasn't brought the African Americans on board, because many of them have heard this story before about how everything's going to get better, and they know it isn't going to get better right away. It takes a long time. So there's Bernie, 78 years old. He'll be 79 in September, up against a 73-year-old sitting president. And so, you know, this says wonderful things about people in their 70s, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a very fair point. And particularly when we do look at Bernie Sanders, though, Professor, because back in 2006, I mean, he himself was blown out in South Carolina. That's really what did it for him at the time. You mentioned, though, the heavy African American vote in the state of South Carolina itself. How important is it for him to appeal to those voters?
Well, he's got to look like he's appealing to them. Keep in mind that the African Americans represent 12% of the American public. They are now superseded by the Latinos, or the Hispanics, who represent 17%, and Bernie did pretty well in Nevada with the Latino voter. There are not so many blacks there, but he's going to have to lift up his numbers there. And those blacks, by the way, who don't vote for him, it's not like they're going to vote for Donald Trump. They'll just stay home with a whole lot of other people who figure there's nothing in it. You know, Americans got to roll out of bed on that second Tuesday in November, which happens to be Melbourne Cup Day. It's a real easy day to remember here. But they got to roll out of bed and go vote. And they don't get the day off, and there's no penalty if they don't vote. So some of them vote with their feet. They just stay home. And that's their protest vote. So Bernie's going to start to have to do pretty well among these the African Americans, because they do constitute the majority of most of America's inner cities. Well, the CBD areas of America's cities. So, you know, he's going to have to appeal to them sooner or later. And if he's really smart, he'll bring on probably an African-American running mate, maybe a woman, some guy, I don't know, somebody who's popular in the black community. That would certainly stitch him up a little bit and make it look like a pretty good idea. But everything's going to depend on the South Carolina, which tells us about Biden's future, or lack of it. And then we go to Super Tuesday, which is a roll of the dice. And, of course, we have Michael Bloomberg, the millionaire mayor from New York City, who thinks he can take Bernie on at the end of the day at the Milwaukee convention in July, and he's sure that he can beat Donald Trump down the road. So it's all getting terribly interesting. And you know, Danica, you couldn't make these people up. They come right out of general casting. I mean, they're all incredibly unique, and they're all terribly interesting people.
Absolutely.
And they all come together every 4 years because, hell, you know, everybody wants to be president of the United States.
Well, speaking of interesting people, I mean, this week we've seen Donald Trump really digging into Mike Bloomberg, saying that he could drop out soon, given he has performed so badly in the debates. How likely is that, Professor? Could he potentially drop out of the campaign?
Well, he could drop out if he finds out that his $400 million didn't buy him too many votes. But I think he's the one that President Trump ought to be worried about. I mean, I never thought the election would come down to a property developer from the Queens and the mayor of New York City. But I think Michael Bloomberg has the skills and the capability to take Donald Trump on and keep in the background here. Trump's taking credit for the economy and all the rest of it. But as this coronavirus starts to pick up speed around the world and it's threatening the American markets and all the rest of it, people like Bloomberg is a perfect guy to deal with large organizations on public health. President Trump has shown no ability to organize anything in the long public health. In fact, everyone's jumping up and down that he's fired hundreds of scientists who work for the National Security Council who could have prevented this kind of thing, or at least could deal with it very quickly. So I think if I were Trump, I'd worry very, very much about Bloomberg, because he can take him on New York style, and that means they're going to play rough.
Let's move on now. This week, Donald Trump visited India. He didn't get a free trade agreement out of it. Do you think that the trip overall was a waste of time?
Not for Trump. He loves to go to these places, and he had 110,000 people in the stadium all cheering his name. I mean, this is really balm for the soul. You know, Woodrow Wilson used to do this, and American presidents love to go overseas and hear everybody adoring them, and so they can go back home again. Look, India is an important country for the United States. It's one of the basic checks and balances to the former Soviet Union, Russia, to Putin. It's also a check and balance to China, so they're an important potential military ally. And look, you can't ignore 1.5 billion people. I mean, they have a lot to say. And Modi and Trump both represent the populist streams of their own people. That is, people sort of get fed up with middle-of-the-road politics, and they turn to people who are highly nationalistic and who say they can get certain things for them, and they have a lot in common. So it's a good opportunity for Trump to sort of have his ego stroked, and Modi did not hesitate. At the same time, Trump, I think, sold him billions of dollars worth of attack helicopters over a period of time. So the American military industrial complex, wherever Trump goes, is able to chalk up sales. So he likes to do that too.
I want to talk about Julian Assange. Part one of his extradition hearing to the US has finished and adjourned now until May. Overall, Professor, when we look at the case as a whole, is this a test case for the protection of journalists in the Trump era?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I like the Julian Assange case because it highlights a lot of important things. Many years ago, people like Daniel Ellsberg, who were also whistleblowers, were lionized in the United States for his role in the Pentagon Papers, and it's no accident that he's a good friend of Assange, who's seen as an information vigilante. The only trouble with Assange is that there's no adoring public today that wants to take him on. He looks like he hacked into the American military computers with Chelsea Manning, and so the Americans want to put him away. He also published a lot of things that Putin's people were able to get on the Democratic Convention. So he's a key figure here. The thing with Assange is they say he's not a journalist. He's just a spy. But all the material he had, he gave to The Guardian and the New York Times, and they're not going to jail. Nobody there is going to be prosecuted. But Assange has got a very special place. The Democrats want to shut him up. I'm sorry, the Republicans want to shut him up, and the Democrats are mad as hell at him for releasing all these things over the years. And as far as I could see, his maximum security cell in Florence, Colorado, is getting fitted right now for curtains, because they're going to put him away for 178 years if they can get their hands on him. Now, he is seen by a number of people in the world as a political prisoner. I regard him as a genuine journalist. He's a bit of a Fruit Loop in a certain sense, but he released information because he thought it was important. Some of it actually pointed to war crimes. I'm talking about those helicopters, Apache helicopters, that killed a couple of Reuters correspondents, and I think it was in Baghdad or wherever it was. And so he has a valuable role. The trouble with Julian Assange is nobody likes him, and nobody wants to come to his rescue. You think that as your typical Australian larrikin, he'd have some support in this country beside Mr. Wilkie, but there's no interest in bringing him home or protecting him from the American justice system. Now, the Brits don't want to turn him over, some of the Brits, because they're very angry that that wife of the American diplomat who ran over that guy, who ran over that young man, is not coming back, cannot be extradited to Britain because the Americans told him to go stuff themselves. So, you know, they say, well, look, we can trade this off, but even the opposition party in Britain is having a hard time selling him as a political prisoner. But in many ways, he is. I think Assange is a terribly interesting case. His shadow is across an American election, scandals, and now the right of journalists to tell their story. And I wish he'd gone to America in the first place on a volunteer basis and got all those First Amendment lawyers like Ellen Dershowitz on his side, and he'd have put up the case of the century. And look, he might not have won, but they'd be singing songs about him 10 years from now.
Well, it's certainly an interesting case, one no doubt you'll be watching very closely. Professor Joe Siracusa, as always, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.